Thank you everyone for joining. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Molly Ross. I'm the Vice President of Operations here at the Technology Association of Iowa. This is our DEI Spotlight Series. For those of you who this may be the first time joining us, this is a series of conversations put on by TAI's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, a group of volunteers who help us do the work here at TAI, and we couldn't be more thankful for that. This really spun out of a number of conversations that committee has had about learning from one another and learning from other organizations who, may not have all the answers, but at least maybe are a step ahead. Super excited for this month's conversation. This is focused on LGBTQIA and inclusion in the workplace as a practice. Before we get started, just a quick note, this is really intended to be conversational and interactive. I will let our speakers fill you in on that, but we left this as an open meeting in hopes that people want to engage. Feel free to turn your microphone and your camera on and ask a question or drop anything in the chat, and we will go from there. So with that, I will introduce our moderator, host of today's conversation, Julie Clark. She is the Managing Director of Human Resources at Kingland Systems. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Molly. Thanks for the introduction and kicking us off. Hi, everyone. As Molly mentioned, I'm Julie Clark. I'm the Director of Human Resources at Kingland Systems. We're a global enterprise software company headquartered in Clear Lake. I am located in our Ames office, but we have a presence in Dalian, China, and we're just opening up an office in Southwest Florida. So some exciting growth for our company. Kingland's been TAI members for several years now, and I've joined the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for I think just about a year now. So it's been a really great experience to network with this group and connect with like-minded individuals in our great state, and just be able to positively contribute to this important topic in our communities and organizations for the employees that we serve. So thanks everyone for being here. We have Heather Schott with us today. She's our guest speaker, so I'll be our moderator, and we'll be pinging Heather with all of our kind of questions and commentary. Heather is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager at Krause Group, which is the holding company for Come and Go. I don't know if you're like me, but Come and Go is a much more recognizable name than Krause Group. And Heather also serves on the West Des Moines Chamber Board. So as Molly mentioned, please use the chat function or speak up with questions or comments. I'll try to moderate as best as I can and kind of monitor the chat, but also please feel free to speak up and make this a conversation. We want it to be valuable for all of you. So with that, we'll dive right in. So Heather, why don't you start we can get you warmed up here. Share a little bit about your professional background, how you landed in the DEI profession, and share your why for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure. Well, thank you, Julie and Molly and TAI for inviting me. I'll tell you first and foremost, I'm a disruptor, not a derailer, a disruptor. And I'm going to show that just through my professional path, right? And how I got to DEI. So not too long ago, I attended these functions as an actual contributor in the IT community, where I had spent around 17 years with Principal. If I go way back, my Wayback Machine here, I actually have 2 BS degrees, 3 if you count DEI, right? I'm teasing on that one. 2 BSs in math and business. So I started off as a super nerdy business individual who decided I wanted to learn more and figure out how I could use a math degree in the business setting. And I'm going to age myself a little bit. It was a little bit before the year 2000, and this big financial organization down the street here from us at Krause Group said, "Hey, will you come over and learn COBOL?" So here's where I'll say I disrupt. I come in with certainly a lot of knowledge and experience for math and business, but had to learn how to develop COBOL on the job. And yes, COBOL is still a good development skill. Rumor has it they're paying more and more for that, since nobody's going to school for that. So who knows, maybe I'll end up back in the tech community someday down the road. As I shared, I spent 17 years in IT, 3-ish years in corporate actuarial, and 5 years prior to this gig at Krause Group leading a DEI I guess, build out at Principal. I want to pause for a second and help you understand how you get from math to IT to DEI. And I'll make this really quick connection for you that it's all about innovation. You see, I learned real quick at the tables that I sat at that there wasn't a lot of diversity, right? There wasn't gender diversity. There absolutely wasn't racial diversity at those tables, and even ability status diversity was lacking. And what I learned through my disruption, because I was asked a lot of those, why, how come, tell me more questions up front, I learned those weren't always part of the equation of driving technology. And through my years of experience, learned that that was actually hurting us. It was slowing us down. It wasn't getting us to innovation. And as I grew up, maybe we'll say got a little more courage in the organization, I realized that just by changing the conversation, to look for the what if, to look for the innovation, it allowed me to grow my career in a faster progression, and eventually got me to the point where I got involved in employee resource groups. If anybody knows Principal, that's a good network kind of boost in the organization to get to know folks and get to try different things. So for me, it was really stepping into the diversity, equity, and inclusion space with a lens of innovation. How do we get more voices working on those business issues and initiatives going forward? And honestly, how do we get those tables ready for folks to come in to disrupt, not derail, but disrupt the conversation? So my why starts there within the business setting, and also from the personal setting as a lesbian in Iowa and moving here from Minnesota. Right, there were some, we'll say, bumps along the way in acceptance. And one thing I want to clarify with this group is I don't speak for everyone in the LGBT community. I don't speak for everybody in the diversity community, but I'm going to share a viewpoint today, right? A viewpoint of someone who has lived life here in Iowa, worked in large corporations, and is now leading another build out of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I share this from the viewpoint of someone who's had kids in this space, who's gone through, partnering in the community and the school systems just to do simple things like, hey, let's update the forms so it doesn't always say mom and dad, right? That certainly helps the LGBT community, but guess what? It also helps individuals, kids, right, that aren't being raised by their mom and dad. They might be raised by their grandparents. They might have foster parents, right? They might have important adults in their life that just don't use those same terms. But what I hope that we can influence and kind of talk through today is, some of these slight adjustments that we make absolutely can help the LGBT community, but it really does help all in that. So Julie, I'll stop. You'll see it's hard to wrangle me sometimes.
That's awesome. No problem. You talked about your strategy being a lot around innovation, right? Using diversity, equity, and inclusion to drive innovation. So tell us a little bit more about that. Why is that important, and what successes have you seen in your career using diversity and inclusion to help drive innovation and growth?
Right. So one thing, Julie, that I always start with is, what are the business outcomes? So we all have to know our skill sets, and me personally, my skill set is within the business community to drive change, right? It's not that I won't be an activist and out there in the community, but I've realized that my skills align with businesses and with the systems inside of businesses. So math background, IT, right, logical person, I'm going to look for those systems and kind of shift away from the emotion. DEI, if you want to stress me out, tell me it's the right thing to do, because that's where I'll tell you, yeah, absolutely, it's the right thing to do to be good people. But from a business perspective, it's absolutely essential to get to innovation. So let's think a little bit about innovation. Innovation comes from new ideas, right? And if we're going to sit down and innovate, and we're sitting down with folks that have had every life experience just like us, we're probably going to get to the same solutions of the business problems that are in front of us. And so the innovation piece really comes into play when you find people with different life experiences, different perspectives, different interactions with this world around us that can look around different corners and help us see a new solution or multiple solutions to a new goal, right? As I shared earlier with, the simple change on a form, you make that change, and it helped to drive the LGBT community to fill out the form, but it also helps others, right? Others that don't have whatever we define as the traditional family, right? Not every family, in fact, most families don't fit within that, right? And so how can we be more inclusive in that work? Again, in the business setting, how can we be more inclusive to gain access to all customers, right? To gain access to all talent. It really is an access perspective to getting to the right innovation and the right people to help us solve those problems. So not just Heather's idea. I'm gonna throw out my first book at you all. Indivisible is written by two individuals, Allison Maitland and Rebecca Steele. So Rebecca was my mentor when I stepped into this space. And here's what I'll say is, if you're looking for a DEI strategy book, like how you actually tie DEI to business outcomes, this is the book for you. If you're looking to understand how we could approach systems in a different way, that's the book for you. And there's actually a guide online if you want to do a book study within your organization. So I do love and cherish this book and leverage it in almost all of my conversations. So Julie, I'll just sprinkle in insights as we're going through here too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Hey, I want to go back to one of your initial comments that you kind of describe yourself as a disruptor. And I keep wondering instead of what or versus what, like disruptor for, like, tell me more about that.
Yeah. So Julie, I'm going to ask you as an HR professional, when someone comes in and says they're a disruptor, how do you feel about that statement? I need you to help me with this conversation.
Yeah, I think it depends. Are you disrupting in a good way or a destructive way?
Right. So that's exactly how my first HR senior leader responded to me describing myself as a disruptor when I stepped into DEI. You know, looking back, I can giggle and it's a fun conversation. But it's why I say I'm a disruptor, not a derailer. And so what I mean by that is I'm going to ask questions from a different angle, right? So if we are, if we're stepping into a new application and we're trying to figure out, is this, let's say an app, or develop an app for technology to order foods in Come and Go, right? Is that app able to meet customers that cannot see in the same way that you and I do? What if we have someone who can't see color, right? Does this actually drive us to a different conversation if we start to use shapes and other identifiers or ways to pull it out differently? So that's where I'll come at things from that different perspective. Looks like I've got somebody helping me in the chat here too with stuff. I love it. And I love Dr. Smith here. Your perspective too is you don't stand for status quo. You're always looking for ways to see things differently. That is me, right? I'm challenging those, and I actually at first fought it, right? I tried to fit in. In fact, I'll tell you, coworkers will tell you at my last organization, I didn't want to be the gay face of whatever, right? I wanted to be known for my abilities. And once I accepted who I was internally, so it was an internal battle there for me. Once I accepted who I was and realized that this was my superpower, this was my differentiator, and I started to leverage that, my career took off. My ability to influence really took off. But that's where that disruption comes from, and that's where I've learned to embrace it, Julie. Even when I make HR nervous.
All right. So switching gears a little bit, going back to the conversation, Heather, that you and I had a couple of weeks ago. One of the, I think, tenets that you kind of stand on is building this culture of trust. So can you talk to us about what those tenets are for building a culture of trust, and what that means for both team members and then also from kind of a client or a customer perspective?
Yeah. So trust is essential to get folks to open up. When we talk about really driving innovation, I think at this point you all have heard that, diversity doesn't work without inclusion. So what that really means is that if you've got a diverse table of individuals sitting there working on a problem, and that's that could be anywhere. If no one is willing to share their perspective or ideas, or we haven't created that safe space, they're not able to come to the table with those ideas, or maybe even they're not willing, right? As a leader. So for me, I step back and I look at, I'm going to give you another resource, Donna Redwing, Google her, an iconic LGBTQ leader within the state of Iowa, unfortunately passed a couple of years after retiring from One Iowa, but also as a national icon within this space. But she did some work around civil dialogue. And when I talk about trust, I really go back to the partnership that she and I had when she was developing this, right? And bringing it into the corporate setting was to really start with civil dialogue, creating that trust. And we can't build trust if we don't start with listening, right? You really have to kind of develop these behavioral expectations to listen first, to understand no matter who we are, we can't have every perspective or know every perspective. It's important for me as a DEI leader to be vulnerable, to explain to my teams that I haven't lived every life. And so even though I'm telling you I'm an out lesbian, gender nonconformer, part of this community, I can't say what it's like to be transgender and Black, right? And I have to be vulnerable and open enough to hear another perspective. We need to figure out what the root cause of the problems are together and focus on those problems, not on the people, right? So if you take a look at what's happening in our political environment and the lack of working across boundaries or across parties, is the ability or the lack of the ability to really work on a problem together instead of fighting with each other. So I'll say the easiest way to win an argument is to other a group of people, is to create a common enemy, right? And the harder way to get to a solution is to figure out a way that works for all and be inclusive. And so I know that's hard. I know that's more work, and we have to lay that out within the DEI framework as we roll that out, because within a work environment, the fight's not internal, right? The fight is for customers. In fact, there is no real fight. We're trying to compete, and we have to remind people sometimes of that. The one differentiator I think of Krause Group that's I was able to drive within what we lay out as our behavioral expectations around trust is that we're open and honest about seeking to become an ally and actively and intentionally working towards equity and inclusion. And so what that means is all of our leaders go through training and have this understanding that we are here to advance our organization and create fair opportunities, equitable opportunities for everyone to succeed. And it is a little different conversation. Most people will hear that, hear me talk through the slide and kind of walk through these tenets and say, I've never experienced DEI like this. And that's okay. I like being disruptive and radically different and following the work that Donna really laid out. And, I hope I can, uphold the great memory and the great work that she did by continuing this conversation with others.
This is totally off the cuff, so I might kind of botch it a little bit and it might not
That's
come
okay.
out very fluently here, but I was driving up to Clear Lake last week one day, and I was listening to a Brene Brown podcast, and she was talking with her colleague about creating safe spaces versus bold spaces. And there's some work in this area around the differentiator there, because we can't necessarily make someone else feel safe. There's not much that I can do to make someone else feel safe. I can try, but it's really on that person. And maybe a different way to look at it is, how can we create bold spaces for individuals to make them feel comfortable and confident, not judged, things like that. So when you talked about, that environment and that trust, it kind of reminded me of that podcast. So what phrases or language or body language, or what tactics do you use to help create those kind of safe or bold spaces when you're having these conversations?
Yeah, Brene Brown is great, by the way. She has some really, great insights into challenging kind of how we come to the table, right? Mm-hmm. And making sure that we aren't being epicentric, meaning focused on ourselves, that we instead employ empath-centric, right? So empathy, really thinking about things from another's perspective. And I think that's the way I approach the room. So I'm not in here to change belief systems. Like, I'll sit down with individuals that are anti-LGBT. And be happy to have conversations. I'm not here to change your belief system, but in a work environment, I can set a behavioral expectation. And that expectation is that we will hear each other and we will work together on these business tactics, right? Because we need to be successful. I'm like everybody else. I want my paycheck to grow every single year. I'm in business for a reason, right? So, that's one thing. The other piece is making sure that we really do focus on the problems and not on the people. So the side dialogues, the Iowa passive aggressive nature, you've got to address that, right? And we've got to call things out when we see it. And I guess I will use terminology of call people in versus calling them out, right? I'll be vulnerable and I'll tell you the mistakes I've made. I'll tell you when I make the mistake in the room, because I will. I'm human. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to show people how we actually walk through that, how we apologize, how we, change the behavior and commit to making that change. So much of this work, of that building trust, it's not a checklist. It's not something I can give you to say this is what you do. You have to be authentically you and lean into the conversation in a real way. And that means sometimes, I have to be able to admit I'm wrong. So this is the second company I've rolled out that trust concept to. The first one, I'll say I know some mistakes I made in there based on feedback. One of them was to assume, use the terminology of assume good intent, look for a teachable moment. That's still true. We should probably assume good intent. But what I was doing there that I had to learn was I was asking people who had been harmed by the experience, whatever that might be, to put that harm aside and work on the individual that created the harm, right? And so put their needs first, someone else's needs. I wasn't pausing to actually acknowledge and hear the hurt in that. So here's a scenario where I started off where I thought was a good spot, but had to learn. Like I had to go through experience. I had to create that space and that feedback, and then I have to share that with you that this is genuine. I was genuine in trying to make that change, and I made a mistake. And guess what? Now I've learned and I'm growing, and I don't do that anymore, right? So how you create that space is really model, right? And lean into it. I think I got there with you, Julie, but I don't know how concise I was on that.
You did. You got there.
Okay.
Thank you. That's great. That kind of leads into my next question, which is a little bit broader and a little bit more narrowed into the LGBTQ plus community. What best practices do you recommend to create an inclusive and welcoming environment for the LGBT community in the workplace?
So one thing I'm going to, tell people to do is follow your data. So, spend some time with folks in your space that are from the LGBTQ plus community, or maybe have opted out of it, to give you feedback on what is working and what's not. So here's what I will say with this is you have to listen more than you talk when you ask that question, and be willing to stay curious and go deeper instead of getting defensive. With the LGBT community, there are really small signals that you can do. The kind of trend right now is for everybody to use their pronouns. You can see my name even in here is Heather Schott, she, hers. That's okay to offer them up, but don't force that room, right? Don't force that room to share it, because you may have folks in that room that aren't quite ready to be out. And the one thing that I don't think, people pause and think about very often is that we have to come out every single day, right? When you look like me, maybe not, right? But I mean, I just walk out the door and I'm out. But, people oftentimes have to come out and have to explain who they are, have to explain their partner. My kids have to explain me when I walk into a space, and that's taxing. So, letting people figure out their time to come out, supporting them in it without judgment is, some of the most important things that you can do. And then just share those signals of, maybe you include your pronouns in your email address or when you introduce yourself, but you don't require it. Maybe you create a safe space sticker or something with your logo that shows that you're inclusive. You're showing that. Maybe you talk about events that you've attended, even this webinar, to say, hey, I'm learning and I'm growing, but you don't force anyone else to engage, right? You just leave it out there and let somebody else dig into it. So I'm going to do a couple more, drops here of books. Last summer, we invited Shelley McNamara to come to Des Moines, Iowa, and share her book, No Blanks, No Pause, A Path to Loving Self and Others. This is the easiest read ever, right? But it's a very important read. If you've got that individual in your family that's really struggling with LGBTQ within your network, within wherever, it's a really easy way to follow Shelley's path, her very religious path of coming out and being okay with who she was. Half of this book here, it's not a very long read, half of this book is poetry. You can also use that and incorporate that into conversations in the work environment. So I'd highly recommend that you read this. Shelley is the DEI practitioner or DEI officer with Procter & Gamble. So this is also somebody with a lot of DEI experience that she's infusing that information in here. She'll give you some tips, of how to be confident in the people around you, and be confident in their experience to really help them move forward. The other thing that I'll tell you is with creating a safe or open place for LGBT individuals, you don't have to go over the top, right? Everything doesn't have to be rainbows and unicorns and butterflies. Just showing those small signals. Being gender inclusive, right? Being inclusive when you send an email out to say, hey, partners and spouses are welcome, right? Instead of saying husbands and wives. And you can still use husband and wife because some people will use those phrases, right? But be more open, just those little tiny signals. Instead of walking into a room and saying, hey guys, saying, hey folks, hey y'all, right? That's more of a gender piece, but that is a nod towards the transgender community too, who also will feel left out sometimes with these proper ladies and gentlemen, kind of signifiers when you walk into a room. So it's the little things that people are watching for. It's those little small inconvenience or adjustments that we make to our language that makes you feel included and like you're part of something. And then obviously you can move down the path of larger creating employee resource groups or associate resource groups that are inclusive with the LGBT community and making sure you have those spaces for folks to have important conversations.
Do you have experience with organizational-wide unconscious bias training, and what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so now you're asking me the tough question. I might not be everybody's favorite person. So here's what I'll tell you is I'm a disruptor in the DEI community also. And so I'm not a fan of unconscious bias training, right? Well, here's what you need to know. Everybody has unconscious bias. We all grew up a certain way. We all have learned behaviors and learned experiences that we apply. What I would instead offer is that look for groups that have mitigation strategy training, right? And these are the folks that are going to help you look at your system or help you take a holistic look at your organization and create systems to make sure those unconscious biases aren't driving decisions, right? They're going to help you pause and figure out how you can put a check-in or a system in place to make sure that you aren't being unduly influenced by unconscious bias. Everyone has them, by the way. As a strong female in the working world, I remember taking my first Harvard implicit bias test and seeing that I had this bias towards women. I mean, what the heck, Heather? How am I going to be successful if I have a bias towards myself, right? And you have to dig in and understand that that's just the culture. That's a reflection of the culture that I grew up in. Super male-dominated farming community is where I grew up. You can imagine I was disrupting there. I was the girl in the soybean bin shoveling that all of the truck drivers would crawl up to physically watch. Can a girl keep up shoveling? And yes, I can. Probably couldn't now, but I could then. But you can imagine, like, the culture just infuses. It's the air we breathe, right? And I'm just as likely to have an unconscious bias as anyone else. And it's not me understanding that I have one that's important. It's me understanding how to build that mitigation strategy around it. So would love for you all to take that back to your DEI. What are our mitigation strategies for this unconscious bias?
We've got a question from one of our participants here. How do you create a safe space with teams who are nearly 100% remote or dispersed? which is
Yeah.
a great question. I can relate to that.
Yeah. So I had a really unique and awesome experience of leading a team in India for a period of time, right? And I was the one who was remote. So in that, I had some great learnings that followed me through in DEI. So that was an IT role. But the first thing that this team actually taught me was don't jump into work all the time, start with a relationship and figure out the right level of relationship, right, with the group. So there are some individuals who are more introverted and didn't want to talk within the group. And so I set up 15, 20-minute tea breaks because that's what you do in India. I learned how to drink tea too at 2 a.m. sometimes. But, take that time to develop those relationships within your team. Do some of the icebreakers. I know it's super uncomfortable. I know it's cheesy. Like find some good learning experiences, how you can bring different topics in. Your biggest resistors, put them in charge sometimes of that icebreaker so that they can find a way to engage everyone. Switch it up. Businesses do have needs to get together. And so make sure that you do have some interactions together. You could be creative and you could watch, like we've got the World Cup soccer games, right? So watch that together. You could do it remotely and have conversations online, but do something so that you create that connection. Because if you're going to develop long-term relationships and really move yourself to be inclusive and trusting of each other, you have to get to folks' heart, right? You have to capture their hearts to get to their minds, to change their behaviors and get that expectation set there within the group. So, find those spaces. And here's the other thing too, folks sometimes are more introverted. So create a little sheet of a get to know me, right? Within the group, and obviously be careful about, hey, what would you be comfortable sharing with this group? I might talk about my boxers because that's easier for boxers, 2 dogs, whatever. Just making sure you understood that's what I was talking about there. My COVID dogs, that would be an easy conversation for me to share pictures and talk a little bit about myself. And it might create a connection with me and another person to really help build team. So find those moments regardless of how you're all meeting. I hope that helped.
Find out, Tom, if you can follow up questions, feel free to speak up.
Yeah.
Put them in the chat. One thing, this is total sidebar, but the HR team at Kingland, we're mostly on site together, but some are remote more than others. We started to play the game Music League, and I don't know if anybody's played this before. It's kind of connected with a Spotify account. We've had the most fun with this game, and it's just, to your point, Heather, been a really great way to build connections with somebody that maybe you would never know that this person likes country music and they love heavy metal, and it just has created the greatest conversation. So I'll put that in the chat because it's really, really been a fun time for our team and to get to know one another too and build teamwork and camaraderie and all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I might steal that.
All right. Hey, Julia, are you with us? I know you had a fun. You are.
Yeah, I'm traveling for work. I'm in Kansas City right now, so if there's background noise, I apologize.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Heather, I think I mentioned that one of our committee members had a really unique and fun come and go story. So, and she was willing to share. So
I can't wait.
So Heather, you might have actually heard this because I might have told you last week. So, but I guess we'll bring in the rest of the group. So I myself am a little bit of a disruptor. I like the way you word it better than me. I usually say poke the bear. But yeah, so I bought my first gas station t-shirt that says "Come and Go Gay Rights." And I like to wear it specifically where I think it might give people a little bit of hope, or maybe, like I said, poke the bear. And we were traveling through West Virginia and I had the shirt on and we were at Biscuit World. That's a long story too. But anyway, so the woman behind the counter was kind of staring at me as she was taking our order. And all of a sudden in the middle of the order, she just says, I really like your shirt. She says, my daughter's a lesbian and she doesn't get a lot of support around here. So I think just showing support and creating even just a safe space for myself, and that is my value. That's where I'm aligned. I'm welcoming and inclusive. It really helped her in that moment. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm thrilled to hear, Julia, that our shirt made an impact, right? That was the idea with that. And actually the sales went to the Transgender Law Center.
That's awesome.
And really, I want to say, Taylor, you can correct me on this, but I think we gave 25,000 through sales of that shirt. So kind of a cool philanthropic partnership.
Yeah, well, and it's just, I think it's really important for people to know that you do support them. You know, I'm not gay or lesbian or anything like that, but I, want people to know that they're welcome.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're really great work.
That's a active and intentional allyship, right? Or advocacy. So, just simply wearing a t-shirt can really show up for someone. I'm guessing you don't have access to that clerk, do you?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, if you ever do for any reason, reach back out and we'll make sure they get a t-shirt too.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Thanks, Julia, for sharing. Appreciate it. It's just a great, heartwarming story. I love to hear that. All right, the last question that I have for you, Heather, and then we'll turn it over to more kind of audience Q&A and participation, is just, you've shared a couple of your favorite books. Do you have any others you'd love to share? And also, what are your favorite podcasts?
Yeah. Either
for fun and for LGBTQ plus inclusivity.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, as a DEI leader, like, we never shut off. So fun and work, it's a good and bad thing, right? So Brene Brown, actually, when you brought that up, has some really great information out there. And I would say, something for this group to kind of dig in and kind of deal with our internal feelings. So I'd say Google her. And I know I don't know any specific interviews right now or numbers that I could give you, but that is a good way to start. I shared Indivisible. I shared No Blanks, No Pause. I also would share Jennifer Brown's book, right? I gotta look at it, How to Be an Inclusive Leader. Your role in creating cultures of belonging where anyone can thrive. She also has, I think, as of the last week, a new book that's coming out. She's a partnership with Ken Blanchard, which I'm going to learn more about next week. I'm kind of excited about that. So it'll be interesting to see that work come to life in the HR space in a whole different way. She has different pieces online too, if you want to listen to podcasts versus reading. From a historical perspective, I'm going to tell you The Queering of Corporate America by Carlos A. Ball is a good read. And this will give you a little perspective of how businesses went from really adversaries in the LGBTQ space to allies, and how that was a game changer. Really, that's the piece that I think got us over the hurdle with marriage across the country, was some of this upfront work. And it started from adversaries. It really started from calling people out. So this is a really good story, and I guess not really story, but historical perspective of what happened and how we got to this point. So I tell everybody this when I talk. I want you to listen to a podcast called by Scene on Radio, and it's SCENE, Scene on Radio, called Seeing White. And this is a podcast that really starts looking at the history of the United States through the lens of race, but it jumps kind of all over the board and gets into some LGBTQ issues. I think it's important for us to really look at strategies and what it is within our culture that holds us so tightly to to some of the spaces of non-inclusive behaviors, right? Exclusive behaviors. This is one of the ways where, you know, we have an individual who walks himself through the path, white, middle-aged straight man walks himself through the path of learning. And I will say this podcast will take you a few drives to Colorado and back. Maybe that's how I got through it. So it's not something that you'll get through really quick, but that is my favorite podcast to send people to take more of that holistic view of what's happening in our world and all around us, and really helps us to question how things have always been done, right? So I guess that's where I would start. Anybody else want to throw recommendations in the chat? I love that you're keeping up with me and actually pulling these, Molly, pulling these up.
Thanks, Molly.
I missed the title of the podcast because I was Googling, but we'll get it.
Seeing White, or
Got it.
Seeing White, and it's seen, SCENE, seen on radio. I will say, after watching this, I grew up near Mankato, Minnesota, a little town called Gaylord. How ironic, the lesbians from Gaylord. But there is a part in there where they interview and they start to talk about the largest hanging or massacre of Native Americans was 30 minutes from where I grew up, right? And I hadn't heard that story until I was 40 something. That was a hard one for me to digest. And that's why I'm telling you it's important to dig in.
I actually know where Gaylord is at. I had customers in Gaylord at a previous job. So yeah, that's funny.
Awesome.
But, I put in the podcast, or a podcast called Choiceology. It's actually a podcast from Charles Schwab, I think. So it ends always on investment. But to your earlier point on biases and stuff like that, it does a really good job of breaking down the fact that, you know, we have those biases because we simply would not be able to get through the day if we were not categorizing things and things like that. It's kind of gives the science behind it, and that we shouldn't be afraid of it, that's just the way our brains work, but understanding it and then kind of doing a checks and balance with yourself on those types of things. But they break down a whole bunch of stuff like that. So
that's awesome. I'll check it out too. Yeah, to your point, like our brains have about 2 billion bits of information kind of coming at us at any given moment. And even the best multitaskers can only handle 30 to 45 bits of information, right? So when you think about that, your brain has to create these shortcuts. And these shortcuts are simply your unconscious bias, right? It's how we know to walk in a room if the lights aren't on. We don't have to physically think about turning that light on. We just do it, right? It's something we've been trained to read the room to go through. So looks like we have Dr. Jennifer Smith with her hand up.
I feel like we could do one of these sessions, you know, every day at lunch and not even scratch the surface of all of the multi-dimensions of diversity. Yep. And, you know, part of our purpose in doing this was to try to, you know, share different perspectives and lenses with organizations who, you know, sitting here in Iowa, you made that point earlier, you know, we're not exactly the most diverse, not exactly, you know, the most purple state when it comes to certain, you know, certain belief systems, et cetera, and so forth. But how, you know, I think a lot of times DEI councils, DEI leaders, DEI organizations within corporations struggle a little bit with almost opportunity overload, right? Like how do you pick where to start? And, you know, I think the murder of George Floyd created some low hanging fruit as far as focus area. You know, let's focus on racial equity, diversity, inclusion, all that stuff. You know, and we've had the Me Too movement, gender equity, you know, so we've had these kind of movements. And then, you know, most recently I was in a meeting with a group of intellectual scholars, and we were, our mentor was, his daughter was a minister. Her title wasn't minister, pastor of a church in Colorado where the shooting recently happened. And her church is one that is a very welcoming and inclusive space. And so she was being interviewed by national news organizations, and our mentor happened to be out there while this was going on. And it struck me. It's like, it's such a terrible analogy, but it's almost like whack-a-mole. You know, every time I feel like an organization feels like it's got its hands around, here's what's really important to focus on right now from a social lens. How do we as organization, I'm putting a lot of pressure on you with this question, Heather. So, but how do we as organizations,
I'll hold you up. Yep.
you know, hold it all up, honestly, and don't, you know, make groups of people feel othered in an effort to try to build inclusivity. Does that question make sense?
Yeah.
I know it's not a straight answer. I know it's layered and complex.
Yeah.
I'm curious your thoughts on it. So that's
yeah. So let me help you out with this. One, we're humans. We're going to make mistakes. We're not going to get it perfect, and we can't do everything. So we have to come into every conversation understanding that. You know, I shared I'm a DEI leader of Krause Group, and I have Come and Go. But you all probably don't know we have 4 businesses in Italy, right? We have soccer teams both here and in Italy. We have truck driving. We have farming operations. We have real estate, right? And real estate companies that deal with, you know, apartments that we own. In some of them aren't they're in tough neighborhoods or they're tough complexes. And so we have to talk through what the implications are if we're going to renovate, right? Is there space? So in all of these, like, everything is the most important thing every single day. And so how do I function, right? And figure out where I prioritize my time without not getting overwhelmed. The honest truth is some days I don't do that well. But I find these advocates around me. I find people like Taylor Bowen, who's on this call right now, and I help Taylor and I help everybody in the organization understand this isn't just on me. I'm here to educate and help set up a framework, but they have to bring it to life. And it has to be brought to life in every single incident. And so we have to make those decisions on what we're prioritizing. And unfortunately, sometimes that means we do say no, right? Club Q is very important to us in Colorado Springs because we have stores out there. We've experienced some of this violence, the gun violence that's happening in Colorado Springs. And so it's important for us to show up in a way that isn't, you know, coming in to be the privileged saviors to fix this, but to be a partner to give the folks that can do the work resources, right? And so we're going to make decisions sometimes on when we politically make a statement and stand up, and when sometimes we just hand funds over, or sometimes we do in-kind donations. You know, that's a organization level. And then there's also the personal level. Like, where does Heather Schott spend her time outside of the X hours I work per week, right? And you'll see I don't have a list of 17 organizations that I volunteer at, right? I pick 1 or 2 and I focus on those each year because that's all I can emotionally handle. I still also have to be a parent and also have to provide. So I guess I'm giving you permission a little bit here to really dig into what is the biggest impact of your organization. If you don't work your strategy to figure that out, you'll spiral and you'll make no progress on anything. So, you know, unfortunately, we can't be everything to everyone. We can be advocates in the space, right? We can be allies in the space. And sometimes we have to make those tough choices on what we do and don't speak to. It doesn't mean that internally we aren't having that struggle and that we aren't participating in some way. It just might not be as visible externally. So, you know that this is a big thing. There's not a right answer. DEI has multiple right answers always. And the biggest thing that I'll charge all of you with is, if you have somebody in that DEI space, support them, right? The hardest thing that I have to do is come in and argue for my right to exist within an organization. Like, let's get past that. Show me the business case against this, please, right? Quit asking me for the business case for it. No one made a business case to support white men in senior leadership teams. Right? And if nobody had to make that business case, why do we have to make the business case to support Black females in that same seat? Right? We have to support, you know, our associates, and we need to figure out a different conversation to advance folks and figure out who's missing. So I hope that helped, but feel free to ask some follow-ups.
I think that's brilliant. Because we've started a thing at my firm called DEI Open Dialogues, and once a month we get together and we've been piloting it. So we've tried a couple different forums, but yesterday we tried it with like a focused discussion topic, and our focused discussion topic was essentially how and when do we decide that the firm needs to take a stance on a social issue, whatever that stance might be, whether that is a statement, a donation, fill in the blank, to your point, all of the different
Right.
options that we have. And I relayed to the group the experience I had with my previous organization. Was the previous organization very deliberately decided to not do any public statements for a period of time, and instead focus those resources on really examining our own internal policies and practices to figure out where we needed to clean our own house before we felt confident being able to make strong decisions about, exercising our policies and frameworks as to how, as an organization, we were going to do that. And in parallel, we did exactly what you're talking about. Hey, members of the organization, go out and immerse in the causes that you care about and bring those experiences back into the workplace to help influence how we design these policies and practices and frameworks that we're going to use to make decisions around the future of the organization. And I think that's kind of where we are inside my organization today, is moving toward a framework, because we don't necessarily have that yet to make those decisions.
And even when you put it in place, there's a transformational change management process to get it there, right? And so even though we can say that we're working towards it, we don't have it all figured out. Taylor and I know this. We work together a lot to try to figure this out. So, know that. The other kind of tidbit or information I'll give you is pay attention to what Homeland Security is saying too. Right now, there actually is an alert out for the LGBT community through May of next year, which tells you Club Q is probably not the last time we're going to be talking about this. And so, what can we be doing to support each other in that, as well as what can we be doing to support folks that have the intersection that are, struggling in this space, and then are also part of the Black and Brown community that experience, trauma on a honestly daily basis. It's just not all publicized. And our youth in schools, there's just so much of that.
I just want to say real quick, thank you for mentioning the Homeland Security thing and the alert, because I had no idea, and I'm definitely someone that would have been there that night if I was there.
Yeah.
So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, and it's hard. Like I would have been, I might have been there. I'm too old now. I stay home more than I go out. But 20 years ago, and I have a niece that's just coming out, and is telling us about going out to her first drag show. Excited for her. And also Erin and I, my partner, had this conversation of like, do we tell her to stay home because we know this and she doesn't, right? And we both got to the conclusion of, what, we've lived through this too. We should give her the information, but it's got to be her call. Like, I don't want you to stop living. I just want you to be aware.
Jeremiah, you have a question?
Oh,
yeah. So I had a question. Your lived experience is not my lived experience.
for sure.
And so as I'm working with my daughter's science class and trying to help them and trying to be an ally in encouraging, especially youth, into STEM fields, into these programs. If I could, what are things that maybe well-meaning but ignorant allies have said that you would rather them not say? And what are things that you were not told that would, especially in that kind of middle school, high school, that would have encouraged you or did encourage you into the STEM field? If there aren't people in the field, we can't do the inclusion. So, trying to make sure that everyone realizes, even at that young age, that they're welcome, what to say, what not to say,
Yeah. So that's an amazing question. So thank you for that. And I'm pausing and thinking about my experience coming into the technical or into the math field. I didn't feel like I belonged there. Right. And had I had a volunteer in the school that just even, if you show up and you talk about your teams and you're very intentional about, talking about, hey, I met Molly and I heard Julie and Heather talk today. Right. And you're using others in leadership around you, like as examples, like that would have been a signal for me, right? I knew based on what my dad was telling me that these guys were watching me shovel the grain bins growing up, that I didn't belong out there, but nobody told me I didn't belong, but they sent me enough signals, right? The other research that, again, don't ever believe me, Google it, right? Go out and research it. But in your conversations with group as you're leading as a volunteer, call on the girls first, right? Position the room sometimes. So what we see is just little examples of showing success or leaning into our young gals in that room gives them the confidence. That sounds really funny, right? Same is true, by the way, if you're in a group and you have some people on the phone, right? Call on the people that are on the phone first, because there's a distance bias that comes into play. So that's one of your biases, right? And so if we call on them first, they're going to be more empowered throughout that conversation. There's also a report, and I don't remember it off the top of my head, but you can Google and find this, where sometimes if you just don't acknowledge gender, boys and girls, right? So even by saying boys and girls, because the world has given these young girls the signal that they don't belong in STEM, just by you acknowledging it, by saying boys and girls, please sit down, now you've brought gender back into that conversation for them. How goofy is that? You know, we're seeing, I think they did a study with like ACTs where they reminded girls that they were girls and made them check a box. And then they did worse on their math than the girls that didn't have that experience, right? And so just those little tiny tendencies that have nothing to do with you, but you know, have everything to do with how we set up and how we grow up, can change an experience for folks. So, you know, just that, answering those questions, making eye contact, not being afraid to interact with somebody who's not just like you, that's critical. So thank you, by the way, for volunteering. That's critical for that. I really appreciate that. Any other suggestions from the group? Just being an active dad is amazing. Or uncle, aunt, you know, all of these folks, and showing that support. So your kiddos are going to have a different experience because you leaned into it.